Between 12,000 and 2,300 years before the Common Era, human society underwent a transformation without precedent. For hundreds of thousands of years, survival had depended on movement following herds, tracking seasons, and adapting constantly to fragile environments. During this long span of time, social structures remained small, flexible, and temporary. Around 12,000 BC, the world itself began to change. The last ice age was ending. Glaciers retreated, sea levels rose, and climate stabilized across large regions of the planet. In the Fertile Crescent, in the valleys of the Nile, the Indus, and the Yellow River, predictable seasonal patterns emerged. Wild grains grew more densely. Animals followed regular migratory routes. These environmental shifts created conditions that humanity had never encountered before. Gradually, experimentation replaced pure adaptation. Groups began to return to the same locations year after year. Plants were tended rather than gathered. Animals were managed rather than hunted exclusively. These decisions were not revolutionary in isolation, but together they altered the relationship between humans and nature. Food production became something that could be shaped, stored, and controlled. With permanence came accumulation. Tools, dwellings, and shared spaces grew more complex. Population density increased. Social memory extended beyond a single generation. The earliest foundations of villages appeared, marking a subtle but decisive break from the deep human past. This era did not begin with cities or kings or writing. It began with pressure environmental opportunity, combined with population growth and with human choices that favored stability over mobility. Over thousands of years, those choices would build the conditions necessary for civilization itself. As populations slowly increased, the balance between people and land grew more fragile. Groups that once relied on wide territories now found those spaces narrowing. Seasonal abundance brought short-term security, but it also encouraged larger communities to form around reliable food sources. Over time, success created strain. Permanent settlements introduced new pressures. Fields required protection. Stored grain attracted pests and theft. Water sources had to be managed collectively. These demands altered social behavior, pushing communities toward cooperation on a scale previously unknown. Informal leadership began to emerge, not through authority, but through necessity. Environmental stability did not mean environmental ease. Periods of drought, flooding, or cooling could devastate early farming communities. A failed harvest now threatened entire settlements rather than mobile groups that could relocate. Survival increasingly depended on planning, shared labor, and collective discipline. Inequality also began to appear. Some families controlled better land. Others accumulated surplus food or specialized skills. Differences in access and influence widened gradually, reshaping social relationships. Status was no longer based solely on age or experience, but on control of resources. These pressures did not break early societies apart. Instead, they forced adaptation. The need to coordinate labor, defend territory, and manage scarcity pushed human communities toward more structured systems. What began as a solution to environmental opportunity was becoming a complex social challenge, one that would drive humanity further down the path toward organized civilization. Have you ever wondered how the first cities and civilizations came to be? It wasn't a sudden event, but a quiet, gradual shift. As early societies faced new pressures, life started to change in subtle but profound ways. People began to track the seasons more carefully, not just for today's hunt, but for next year's harvest. Knowledge wasn't written down yet. It was passed on through rituals and shared stories, helping entire communities work together like never before. This led to specialization. While most people farmed, others became expert toolmakers, builders, or food processors. This made everyone more efficient, but it also meant no one could survive alone anymore. People depended on each other. You can even see this change in their buildings. Homes were built on the same spot for generations, and huge storage pits show they were planning for the future, storing surplus food. At the same time, trade networks started to connect distant villages. Rare materials like obsidian and beautiful shells traveled hundreds of miles, linking different groups together. This exchange wasn't just about goods. It was about ideas, innovations, and culture. Slowly, without any grand design, These small changes created predictable patterns of life. Schedules, duties, and shared expectations began to shape human behavior. This was the quiet, unseen foundation upon which all of civilization would eventually be built. Thanks for watching, and if you're curious to learn more about our ancient past, be sure to subscribe. Have you ever wondered how we went from small hunter-gatherer groups to the massive, complex societies we live in today? It all started with a major game changer: agriculture. Once we figured out how to grow our own food, we didn't have to wander around anymore. People settled down, and villages grew into towns, then into bustling cities. But with more people came more problems. How do you manage resources? How do you keep track of everything? That's where administration and record-keeping came in. Early forms of writing, like cuneiform, weren't for writing poetry. They were for tracking grain and taxes. And as societies grew, so did our big questions about life and the universe, leading to the development of organized religion, which provided shared beliefs and social cohesion. From farming to spreadsheets, it's an incredible journey of human innovation. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more. Once systems were in place, growth accelerated. Populations expanded beyond anything earlier human societies had sustained. Villages merged into towns, and towns into cities. By the 4th millennium BC, urban centers such as Uruk housed tens of thousands of people, supported by surrounding agricultural land and managed through layered administration. Numbers changed everything. Food production had to meet predictable quotas. Labor was counted, assigned, and recorded. Construction projects grew monumental in scale, requiring years of coordinated effort. Walls, temples, canals, and storehouses reshaped the landscape, making human presence permanent and unmistakable. With scale came abstraction. People were no longer known individually by everyone around them. Identity increasingly rested on roles: farmer, laborer, priest, scribe. Measurement systems standardized weight, length, and volume, allowing resources to be moved, taxed, and exchanged efficiently. Trade expanded dramatically. River routes and overland paths connected distant regions, linking early civilizations into long-distance networks. Copper, tin, timber, and stone moved across hundreds of miles. These exchanges bound societies together economically while also exposing them to competition and conflict. The growth of scale did not mean stability for all. Managing large populations required constant adjustment. Shortfalls, miscalculations, or environmental shocks could ripple through entire regions. Civilization had gained power through numbers, but it had also become vulnerable to its own complexity. Have you ever wondered what we lost when we gained civilization? For our hunter-gatherer ancestors, life was unpredictable, but it was also free. The rise of settled societies fundamentally changed everything, right down to the rhythm of our daily lives. Before civilization, survival meant moving with the seasons. But with agriculture, life became a cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting. In the new cities, work became even more rigid, with people tied to specific crafts or tasks day in and day out. That freedom of movement, once the very essence of human existence, began to fade away. Now, you might think civilization meant better food and health for everyone, but the reality is more complicated. Yes, we could produce surplus food to support larger populations, but our diets became surprisingly narrow. Instead of a wide variety of foraged foods, we relied on just a few staple crops, like wheat or rice. This made entire communities vulnerable to famine if a single crop failed, and living packed together in dense settlements. That was the perfect breeding ground for diseases to spread like wildfire. Archaeologists can see the toll it took. Skeletal remains from this period often show signs of malnutrition, disease, and the physical strain of repetitive labor. Socially, the world was turned upside down. For the first time, a clear divide emerged between those who worked the land and those who didn't. An elite class rose to power, controlling resources and living off the labor of others through taxes and tribute. Below them, farmers, laborers, and craftsmen formed the backbone of society, carrying the immense burden of production. In many places, this system hardened into forced labor and even early forms of slavery. Even the family wasn't immune to these changes. With land and property came the concepts of inheritance and lineage. Who you were born to suddenly mattered a great deal. Marriage, family ties, and gender roles became more strictly defined by laws and customs, all designed to support the new social order. So, was it all bad? Not exactly. Civilization offered a new kind of security. Communities could store food for lean times, defend their territory more effectively, and build a sense of continuity that stretched across generations. Life became more predictable, even if it was more restricted. Ultimately, the dawn of civilization wasn't a single event, but a series of gradual tricks. We exchanged a measure of our autonomy for a new kind of stability. It's a bargain that has shaped every aspect of our world, and one we are still living with today. What do you think? Was it worth the price? Let me know in the comments below. Legal and administrative structures developed to manage conflict and coordination. Customs were formalized into rules that regulated labor, property, and exchange. Disputes that once might have fractured communities were now absorbed by institutions designed to preserve order and continuity. Cultural expression expanded alongside administration. Art, music, and storytelling reinforced shared identity and preserved collective memory. Monumental architecture served not only practical purposes, but symbolic ones, projecting stability, authority, and permanence across generations. When systems failed, societies adjusted. Settlements were abandoned and rebuilt elsewhere. Trade routes shifted. Political authority changed hands. Collapse, when it occurred, was often partial and regional rather than total. Knowledge and practices survived, carried forward into new forms. Adaptation became the defining skill of civilization. The ability to reorganize without abandoning structure allowed early societies to endure environmental change, internal strain, and external pressure. Civilization was no longer fragile experimentation. It was an evolving framework, capable of reshaping itself to survive. By around 2300 BC, the foundations of civilization were firmly established. Cities governed territories far beyond their walls. Writing preserved laws, transactions, and collective memory. Political authority extended across generations, no longer dependent on individual leaders alone. The structures formed during this period proved remarkably durable. Concepts of property, taxation, organized religion, and centralized administration became recurring features of complex societies. Later civilizations did not reinvent these systems. They inherited and modified them. Power increasingly flowed through institutions rather than personal relationships. This shift allowed societies to scale further, but it also reduced flexibility. Decisions made at the center affected distant populations, sometimes with limited understanding of local conditions. The tension between control and responsiveness became a lasting feature of civilization. Environmental consequences also accumulated. Intensive agriculture altered soils, waterways, and ecosystems. Forests were cleared, land was exhausted, and water systems were diverted. Human influence over the environment became systematic and enduring. Most importantly, this era fixed a trajectory. Once large-scale civilization emerged, there was no return to earlier social forms on a comparable scale. The systems created between 12,000 and 2300 BC became the framework within which later history unfolded. By 2300 BC, human societies had moved beyond survival into shaping the world itself. Small, mobile bands of foragers had transformed into large, structured communities, capable of storing knowledge, managing resources, and projecting influence over vast landscapes. Civilization was no longer an experiment. It had become a self-sustaining reality. The consequences of these early developments would ripple across millennia. Agriculture, trade, writing, and centralized authority set patterns that would define every subsequent civilization. Human life became more predictable, yet more constrained. Communities became larger, yet more dependent on complex systems. The world of 12,000 years ago had ended, replaced by a world in which humans could alter rivers, create cities, and leave enduring records of their existence. The birth of civilization was not marked by a single event, victory, or invention. It was the accumulation of countless choices, adaptations, and innovations over thousands of years. Quietly, persistently, humanity had laid the groundwork for every society that would follow. And in that quiet persistence, the story of civilization itself began.